Hi there, it is Tara C. again, and we are going to be doing Chapter 1, finally, of Mountains of Spices. So, the title of this chapter is Mrs. Dismal, Forebodings. But before that, here's the scripture basis for the title of the book. Make haste, my beloved, and be thou like to a roe or to a young hart upon the mountains of spices. And it says cant, which means canticle of canticles, or, as some call it, song of songs. Chapter 8, verse 14. So here we go. And there's the table of contents. Da-da-da. And the preface, we already have done the preface. And I will link that video to this particular video. But for right now, we're going to be doing Chapter 1, Mrs. Dismal Forebodings. And we are going to meet her best friend, Mrs. Valiant. You'll like her. It was a perfect spring morning down in the Valley of Humiliation, and everything seemed to be rejoicing in the sunshine, in the warm sunshine, and the soft, fragrant air. The pastures were robed in freshest green. The fruit trees were wearing festal apparel of white and pink blossoms. In the breeze, the wildflowers were dancing gaily, while the asphodels, with the sun shining through their transparent white blooms, stood rank on the steep slopes above the blue lake like an army of wax torches. In the pastures, through which the river wound, the lambs frisked about their mothers, and the kids played "Catch Me If You Can" among the rocks. Birds of every size and description worked ardently at the business of nest building, and the air echoed with the sound of innumerable notes and calls and trills, while bees and crickets kept up constant undertone of humming. Altogether, it was a perfect day down there in the valley, with everything that had breath and moved out in the open to welcome spring. In the shadow of some old, dark, twisted trees, however, standing back from the main road, which ran through the village of Much Trembling, was a garden, overgrown with weeds and sickly-looking cabbage plants. Moping in the middle of the garden was a most dilapidated cottage, the windows and doors of which were all tightly shut. Up from the chimney of this cottage rose a thin, furtive-looking spiral of smoke, which crept up into the air as unostentatiously as possible, as though ashamed to show itself on such a perfect day as this. Inside the cottage, cowering over the smoky little fire, sat Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, wearing a dreary-hued dress and wrapped in a drearier gray shawl, while her face wore an expression of deepest misery and gloom. There came a brisk rap on the door, and almost before Mrs. Dismal's hesitating "Come in" could be heard, in marched her neighbor, Mrs. Valiant. The contrast between the two women was as great as possible, and everyone in Much Trembling wondered at the friendship, if such a one-sided affair could be so named, which existed between them. But it dated back to their school days, and Mrs. Valiant seemed to have a queer notion, as the neighbors called it, of not allowing the friendship to drop. Mrs. Valiant marched into the room, stopped short, and uttered what sounded exactly like a little snort. "Good gracious, Dismal!" she exclaimed. "What are you doing in here with all the windows shut on such a perfect day as this? That horrid little smoky stove is enough to suffocate you." "Please shut the door behind you at once, Valiant," said Mrs. Dismal fretfully. "The draught is simply cruel, and this dreadful east wind always increases my rheumatism unendurably." "East wind," said Mrs. Valiant with another snort. "My dear Dismal, the air is as balmy as on a midsummer day, and what little breeze there is coming directly from the south." "My weathercock never lies," replied Mrs. Dismal firmly, "and when I looked at it this morning, the wind was in the east. Besides, I feel it all over me in every bone and joint of my body, and do not even need the confirmation of the weathercock." "At least," urged Mrs. Valiant, "let me open the south window, and do, my dear Dismal, allow yourself to be persuaded to lay aside that dreadful shawl, and to put on something cooler and prettier, and come out with me for a little while, for," she added in a mysterious tone, "the most delightful and unexpected thing has happened, and I have come along on purpose to take you to my cottage, so that you can share in the pleasure." Mrs. Dismal, however, refused to be either curious or interested. Instead, she poked the fire, causing a thick spiral of choking smoke to billow out into the room, and said with a shiver, "Please leave that window alone, Valiant. Even if it were the warmest of days, I would not venture out of the cottage today, for my almanac tells me that it is a black day. A day of gloom and darkness and danger and harm would most certainly befall me if I ventured outside. I have great faith in my almanac, and I never disregard its warnings." "What almanac is that?" cried Mrs. Valiant, walking up to the wall, on which was pinned a large and hideous monstrosity. "Why, Dismal, don't tell me you've gone in for astrology. This is printed by a well-known firm of swindling frauds who live by exploiting the fears of other people. It's pure nonsense." Mrs. Dismal looked much affronted, and answered tartly, "I have never known my valuable almanac to be mistaken. When it says that woe and calamity are approaching, woe and calamity of some sort always do follow, and I shall not be foolish enough to disregard its warnings today, but shall remain indoors." "I wish you would let me tear the horrid thing off the wall and throw it on the fire," exclaimed Mrs. Valiant in exasperation. "And let me put up one of the red-letter calendars, which I use myself for today. Mine says, 'This is the day which the Lord hath made. We will be glad and rejoice in it.'" "Nothing will induce me to discard my valuable almanac," said poor Mrs. Dismal. "Neither shall I venture to set foot outside the cottage today. As sure as my name is Dismal, Forebodings, calamity is near." "If I had a name like that," cried Mrs. Valiant, suddenly losing all patience, "I would certainly get rid of it and change to a better." Mrs. Dismal was deeply offended, but whenever her warm-hearted, if rather quick-tempered neighbor became impatient, she always reacted with martyr-like resignation. So now she said in a tone of patient reproach, "It is a very ancient and honorable name, Valiant. It has been incredibly demonstrated to date back to before the flood. There have been dismal forebodings for longer than can be reckoned." Mrs. Valiant laughed heartily at her friend's absurdity, though this was one of the times when she felt she would dearly like to shake a little sense into the poor silly creature before her. But she had an inner reason, known only to herself and the chief shepherd, for bearing along with her unhappy neighbor and learning to accept her lovingly just as she was. So now she answered cheerfully, but tactlessly, "Well, the antediluvian dismal forebodings must have become extinct anyhow, for there were none of them in the ark. I wonder who was foolish enough to found the family name again." Mrs. Dismal was now too offended to reply. She drew her shawl closer around her shoulders, shivered, and appeared to be unconscious that there was anyone beside herself in the cottage. Mrs. Valiant's conscience smote her. It was really dreadful the way she let her tongue run away with her when she had come on purpose to try to help her friend. She hurried to apologize, saying penitently, "Forgive me, Dismal dear. I know I ought not to have said that. But oh, how I wish you would let me help you out of this unhappy condition into which you have fallen, and persuade you to put off the spirit of dreariness and put on the garment of praise." Mrs. Dismal burst into tears. "How can you talk like that, Valiant? You are absolutely heartless. I am sure I was always cheerful and contented enough before, but now that all this cruel trouble has come upon me, what can you expect? A desolate widow woman all these years, working myself to death to provide for my 3 unfortunate children." This was a bit of invention, Mrs. Dismal's husband having left her a small but adequate annuity, "and to bring them up respectively and prepare them for happier homes of their own than ever fell to my lot. And now what has happened? You know, Valiant, you know perfectly well, yet you are heartless enough to stand there rebuking me for being miserable. My daughter gloomy, deserted by her graceless husband, her position lost, put to shame before all her relatives, and obliged to come creeping home to her widowed mother. She, the daughter-in-law of Lord Fairy himself, with no one prepared to lift a finger to help her get her rights. And then poor Spiteful, to find herself married to a drunkard who beats and abuses her shamefully, forced to live in a miserable little attic, a poor despised relative in the house of her cousins, and Craven." There she sobbed convulsively. "My darling Craven, my only son, wrongfully condemned on a trumped-up charge of assault and disorderly behavior, actually put in prison. And you, Valiant, who did at least once have a strong husband to support you and still have children who apparently never cause you the least sorrow, there you stand, upbraiding me and actually suggesting that I ought to put on the garment of praise, whatever sort of fantastic apparel that may be. It would obviously be utterly indecent clothing for a broken-hearted widow whose children are enduring a martyrdom of injustice and suffering." Mrs. Valiant went up to the weeping woman and put her arms comfortingly around the shaking shoulders, saying very gently, "You misunderstand me, Dismal. I do know all about your sorrows and troubles, and it would make me so happy to be able to comfort you a little bit and to help you find strength and courage to meet them and grace to transform them into something lovely. That is really why I'm here this morning. Let me tell you the happy news, dear Dismal, and persuade you to go with me to my cottage. For do you know what has happened? No, I am sure you will never be able to guess. Something to gladden even your sad heart. She paused, hopefully looking for a gleam of interest, of curiosity in the miserable face before her. But Mrs. Dismal, Forebodings, continued to sob and to rock herself backwards and forwards, utterly indifferent to anything else in the whole wide world except her own misfortunes. So after waiting a moment, Mrs. Valiant went on in a voice full of cheerfulness and pleasure. Well, you will never guess, so I will tell you. You remember that when your crippled niece, much afraid, left the valley, people said that the shepherd had taken her to the high places. Well, it was true, perfectly true. And do you know what has happened, Dismal? She has just returned to the valley on a visit, and she isn't crippled any longer. Her lame feet are completely healed, and so is her twisted mouth. She is so strong and straight, you would hardly know her. Besides that, she has got a new name. She is much afraid no longer, but is Grace and Glory. Just fancy that. What a beautiful name to receive. She has also brought her two friends with her, lovely women named Peace and Joy, and they tell us that Grace and Glory lives now in the kingdom of love and is actually a member of the royal household. And everywhere the king goes, she goes too. Just imagine it. Dismal. It's like the most wonderful fairy tale that you ever heard, only far lovelier because it is absolutely true. And it has all happened because she went with the shepherd to the high places. If Mrs. Valiant had wanted to gain the attention of her miserable friend, she had certainly succeeded. Mrs. Dismal Forebodings sat staring at her in what appeared to be stunned silence, apparently unable to say a word. So Mrs. Valiant went on happily. Now here she is back in the valley, as I said before, and with her two friends. They are over in the cottage with my daughter Mercy, and we are arranging a little party of welcome. Just a few of her old friends and neighbors, and you, her aunt, really must be there too. Come, dear Dismal, just for a little while. Dry your tears, for you cannot in any way help your dear ones by sitting here weeping your eyes out in this dreary room. Put on your best dress and come with me and have a share in the rejoicing over the good things, the wonderful things which have befallen poor miserable little Much Afraid. Mrs. Dismal Forebodings said not a word, for in truth she was almost stunned by the news, the dreadful news. Nothing, she felt, could be more untimely, more horrible, more humiliating than the return of the wretched cripple they had all despised and whose departure they had tried to thwart. Here she was, it seemed, healed, surrounded with friends, advanced to glory and honor, a member of the king's household, now returning almost as a queen to the valley where she had been a miserable, despised nobody. Moreover, returning just in time to find her closest relatives in the most humiliating circumstance possible. Her cousin Gloomy, who had married so well, now deserted by her husband, a destitute beggar in her mother's cottage, Spiteful, married to a drunkard, who had nearly killed her, living a life of penurious misery in a tiny attic, and worst of all, her cousin Craven Fear, whom she had so insultingly refused to marry, now actually in prison. Could the return have been more untimely? Could indeed anything which she, Dismal Forebodings, might have imagined be a greater calamity? "How true my almanac is," said Mrs. Dismal to herself with a sinking of heart, which even she had seldom before experienced. "A day of calamity indeed. No severer blow could have befallen me." She said not a word, however. With an immense effort she bit back the bitter lamentations which almost escaped her lips, for she suddenly remembered that an aunt would scarcely be expected to bewail the fate that a crippled niece had now returned to her old home, completely cured and holding a position in the king's household. "If it had been any of our own relatives telling me the news," thought Mrs. Dismal bitterly, "they would have understood my feelings perfectly, and we could have lamented together. But Mrs. Valiant is quite different. Certainly she would never understand." So she sat in frozen silence. "Come, Dismal," said Mrs. Valiant persuasively, after waiting in vain for some expression of pleasure or interest from her neighbor. "Do come along with me to the cottage and see for yourself the delightful truth of what I have told you. Come and welcome grace and glory, and enjoy the happy fellowship with other friends in my house, and forget for a little while your own grief in rejoicing with another." At that, Mrs. Dismal at last found words. "Thank you, Valiant," she said, "but nothing will persuade me to leave the cottage today, or to do anything so heartless as to seek personal enjoyment at a party, while my daughters eat the bread of affliction and my son languishes in prison. As for Much Afraid," she continued, unable to conceal her bitterness any longer. She certainly was not going to call that girl by any new name the king might have chosen to bestow upon her. "As for Much Afraid, a more undutiful and ungrateful niece cannot exist anywhere. If she chooses to return now to gloat over the misfortunes which have overtaken her relatives, it is only another example of her callous nature, and I, for one, shall certainly not present her with an opportunity to do so. Pray return at once to your party, Valiant, and leave me to the solace of solitude in my misery." Mrs. Valiant regretfully realized that she could do no good by staying longer, that any further importunity would only increase her neighbor's resistance and resentment. So she sorrowfully took her departure, having failed in a mission which, in truth, she had feared would prove unsuccessful. Left alone in the cottage, Mrs. Dismal Forebodings brooded on the disastrous news, and the more she brooded, the worse it seemed. What a cruel blow dealt by fate to permit that girl to return just now, who, if she had married Craven as she ought to have done, would now be as disgraced and humiliated and wretched as her mother-in-law, and a convenient scapegoat on whom the family could have heaped their reproaches. But now, instead of that, here she was, gloriously free, richly provided for, and with an honorable new name. "It's scandalous," sobbed Mrs. Dismal. "The injustice of life, the hammer blows of fate, a calamity of calamities." She sat there brooding bitterly for perhaps half an hour, when she heard a light tap on the door of the cottage, and with a sickening sense of foreboding, she called out sourly, "Who is there?" "It is I, your niece, dear Aunt. May I come in?" And with that the door opened, and Grace and Glory stepped into the cheerless room. In spite of herself, Mrs. Dismal Forebodings looked with eager curiosity at the girl, who had once been much afraid. She saw it was quite true what Mrs. Valiant had told her. There was a great difference in her. She was so straight, and walked with such ease and poise, that it gave one the impression that she was much taller than before. And now that the unsightly, deformed mouth was healed, and she could look unshrinkingly and without self-consciousness into the face of others, she was very unlike the ugly creature of former days. Yet, in another way, thought Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, she's not at all out of the ordinary. Among the crowd there would be nothing to single her out, except perhaps the expression of quiet, steady happiness on her face and the light in her eyes. Grace and Glory hesitated a moment at the door, and then as her aunt offered not a single word of greeting, she walked quietly toward the gray, bent figure crouched in the rocking chair beside the stove, and stooping down, gently kissed her aunt's cheek. Mrs. Dismal Forebodings recoiled almost as though a reptile had approached her, and putting out her hands pushed her niece away. "There is no need for insincere tokens of affection, much afraid," she said coldly. "I can dispense with a kiss from you." Her niece looked at her compassionately, but only said gently, "I can understand just how you feel, dear aunt. I know that I was always sadly lacking in love and in attention to your wishes. But I hear that you have experienced much sorrow since we last saw one another, and my heart aches for you. I long to be able to help in some way, or at least share your sorrow." She paused a moment and then added shyly, "I have been changed, you know, since I went away, and have learned to love. I have a new name now, and I hope a new nature." "So I heard from Mrs. Valiant," said her aunt icily. "But I shall certainly not call you by anything but your real name. It will take more than just a new name, I can assure you, to make me forget what you were before. To me, you will always be much afraid." "Well, I can understand that, too," said Grace and Glory, "and you may call me by the old name if you so please. But," she added smilingly, "Grace is a shorter and easier name to say, and peace and healing have come to me, dear Aunt Dismal, if only I could persuade you in your sorrow and grief and pain to turn to the one who has so graciously and wonderfully helped me." A flush of anger appeared on her aunt's cheeks. "Do I understand you to refer to," she stumbled over the hated name, "to the shepherd, much afraid?" "Yes," answered her niece earnestly. "I beg you, no, rather I command that you will not ever mention that name to me again." And Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, said Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, in a voice shaking with angry excitement, "You know well enough what all of us thought about your disgraceful behavior, forsaking all your relatives in the most heartless manner. But do you know what happened afterwards? Do you know that it was the shepherd of yours who trumped up the false charge against my unhappy son, Craven, which resulted in his being put in prison? My son, my only son, treated as a common felon and sentenced to a 6 months' term of imprisonment." Grace and Glory, who had come to the cottage with her heart overflowing with love and compassionate longing to help her aunt escape from the misery which she herself had known, could think of nothing to say. She had known her own personal memories of Craven fears bullyings, and could well understand how much some hapless victim must have rejoiced to be delivered by the shepherd out of his clutches. Also, that a term in prison might well prove to be a salutary, though bitter lesson to him, but she did not feel that it was the moment to suggest all this to his mother. So she really did not know what to say. It was the dreadful contrast to everything which she had hoped and expected, though grace and glory to herself, which made it so unspeakably difficult. Up there on the high places in the kingdom of love, where every thought was love, and her companion's joy and peace were never absent. How different things had looked, she muttered her wings. Wait a second. How different things had looked. She remembered how but a short time before she had been sitting beside the king in the royal gardens, and they had looked down into this valley, and her heart had ached and throbbed with compassion and with the longing to be able to help her relatives. Nothing had seemed too difficult for love to undertake, if only they could be rescued and delivered from the tormenting things by which they were enslaved. But now, down here, face to face with reality, how different, how almost impossibly different it seemed. Here was her aunt, absolutely shut up with her own miserable self. She could think of nothing else, be interested in nothing else, for all her thoughts were chained to the one wretched center. She was as outside the realm of love as though she lived in a world of outer darkness where love simply did not exist. Oh, how how, thought Grace and Glory, desperately could one get into her dungeon, and how could one strike off the chains which the prisoner seemed actually to cherish and to be unwilling to be rescued from? How could one even speak to her of the only deliverer when she believed that he was the cause of all her unhappiness? Yes, indeed, it was one thing up there in the glory and light of the kingdom of love to find passionate longing to help and save. But when one got right down into the midst of the actual reality, how was it to be done? How could one reach hearts immured in impregnable prisons, and how to awaken even the beginning of a desire for deliverance? Grace and Glory remembered the whole conversation up there on the high places, and how they had all agreed that this was the very likeliest time of all for them to be able and structurally sound. To help Mrs. Dismal Forebodings and her family, because the calamities which had overtaken them would surely make them begin to feel their need of the shepherd's help. But now it was all so different. She remembered the voice of the king saying, "I need someone to speak for me, for they will not come to me themselves," and her glad, exultant cry that she would be his mouthpiece. She remembered the tone in which he had said, "Do you think they will listen to you, Grace and Glory?" What had she answered? "You shall tell me what to say, and I will say it for you." Yes, thought Grace and Glory suddenly, that is the answer. He must tell me what to say. He must teach me. I can do nothing now. But I will go to him and will tell him all about it, and I will ask him to teach me what approach I am to make and how to win right through my aunt's prison house. However, She made one last attempt to break down the antagonism against herself. "Dearest Aunt," she said, "I do hope you will sometimes let me come to see you, to do what I can to help. And perhaps next time you will let me show you how I was delayed from all my news, all my fears and sorrows. Let me tell you how I was delivered from all my fears and sorrows." "Thank you, much afraid," said her aunt icily, "but I am not interested. I know already just what you will say, and it is the last thing I am interested to hear." Grace and Glory, feeling exactly as though she were holding a tiny pebble in her hand with which to try to batter down an impregnable stronghold, rose to her feet and prepared to take her departure. She put her arms around her aunt and kissed the coldly unresponsive cheek, saying softly, "Only let me love you, Aunt Dismal. Let me try to atone in some way for all my lovelessness in the past. Do not let me come to see you and my cousin Gloomy. Do let me come to see you and my cousin Gloomy and help in any way that I can." But the only answer she received was, "You've chosen and gone your own way, much afraid, and it is not my way, and I do not hesitate to tell you that even though misfortune has overtaken me, while good fortune has smiled upon you, I do not at all desire to be pitied and patronized by you. Smitten I may be and left desolate and friendless, but patronized I will not be. You need not trouble yourself to visit here again." Grace and Glory left the cottage and walked sadly away, wondering if anything could have been more unlike her radiant, loving dreams of helping her relatives than the actual reality. For a few moments, she felt almost overwhelmed. When, however, she reached the cottage where she and Mercy had lived together and found her friend and Mrs. Valiant bustling around full of cheerful preparations for the party to which the chief shepherd himself had been invited, and when she saw Joy and Peace, whom she had left at the cottage, telling herself that if she were accompanied by her two handmaidens when she visited her miserable aunt, that she might appear to be showing off. When she met their loving greeting, she did feel a balm applied to her heart, and she said to herself, "Next time I go to visit Aunt Dismal, I shall take Joy and Peace with me." There was just time before the guests arrived for bustling Mrs. Valiant to take her aside for a moment and whisper, "Well, my dear, how did you get on, and what sort of reception did you receive from that poor creature Dismal?" "She told me never to visit her again," answered Grace and Glory sorrowfully, "and I'm afraid she really meant it. You would never believe how many times she said that exact same thing to me," replied Mrs. Valiant cheerily. "But she would be quick enough to object if I took her at a word. Never pay any attention to anything poor Dismal says. My dear, she is starved for love and just doesn't know it. Just go on loving. It always wins in the end." Mrs. Valiant, as you may easily guess without being told, was another who had been with the shepherd to the high places, and wore in her heart the flowering plant of love, which made her a citizen of that kingdom. Then they heard the sound of footsteps outside, and of happy, laughing voices, and the next minute the chief shepherd himself, surrounded by his friends, entered the cottage, and the feast began. The kettle sang on the hearth, the guests talked and laughed merrily together, the yellow cat lay purring on the chief shepherd's knees, and all the black and white one curled up on the lap of Grace and Glory. The sheep dogs lay at the door, wagging their tails, and Mrs. Valiant busied herself filling and refilling the cups with tea, and all in the cottage was the most mirthful and contented spot in the whole world, just as though a little bit of the kingdom of love had been transplanted down to the valley, which of course was the case. "If only poor Dismal were here," sighed Mrs. Valiant just once, and then she looked across at the shepherd and saw that his eyes were looking straight at her as though he read and understood her thoughts. Then Mrs. Valiant gave a little contented smile and said to herself, "He'll be all right. He wants it even more than we do. It will take more than poor Mrs. Dismal. It will take more than poor Dismal and her unhappy family to evade his love in the end." Then she went on bustling about, filling cups and attending to the wants of everyone, and was, without in the least realizing it, next to the chief shepherd himself, the most cheering and heart-warming person in the room. And that is the end of Chapter 1, Mrs. Dismal Forebodings. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace.